Be careful what you say now.
All right, I'll start out with introduction to Tom. So Tom's got 2 books. There's some of them over here, and he left them here for us to kind of share, basically. So if you want to take one, read it, bring it back so other people can read them. But the one is about it takes courage and coping with chronic illness. And I think that's your first book you wrote, right, Tom?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
And then you got the living well with MS, and Tom kind of writes the books almost from a different perspective of somebody living with MS, and also that's really highly educated in MS. And I think that you did a really nice job, Tom.
Oh, thank you.
And I didn't get to read them all, but I did skimming. So,
I would love your feedback.
yep. So I'm going to take just a second and move the camera here so you can kind of see the room that you've got. Yeah. So I don't know. Can you see people there? No. Yeah. There we go.
Oh, that's good.
So this is kind of the crowd that you're here.
Great. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you for being here. Absolutely.
Yep. And just so everybody knows, we do have a microphone in the middle of the room. So if you have questions for Mike, we would like this to be somewhat interactive. Or questions for Tom, we'd like this to be somewhat interactive. So maybe speak up so that the microphone picks it up. And Tom will let us know if you heard it or not. And if not, we can repeat the question for him. So other than that, Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, you got to share my screen.
Share your screen. Okay. I think I probably have to give you permission to share a screen, right? You're pushing your limits. Share screen. Multiple participants. Try it now.
Ah, there we are. Can you all see that okay?
Yes. Yes.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that, putting this all together. When I first visited your facility there, I was really, really impressed because I've been around the MS community, as it were, for a very, very long period of time. I've had MS for well over 50 years. And I've been involved with many, many different situations where I've given a lot of presentations. And one that I, excusing the pun, never get tired of is talking about fatigue. Fatigue was my major symptom when I first started dealing with my journey with MS. And as an old high school and college athlete, I knew what fatigue was, but this kind of fatigue was quite a bit different. So I bring to you a perspective related to fatigue from an MS standpoint, but also from a personal MS standpoint, but also what I've learned over the years from other people. My involvement with the MS Society spans over 42 years. That been involved with a lot of different situations. And I learned more about my MS from being around other people with MS. And there's a lot of things that have happened to me that were reinforced by people that I knew with MS. So this is going to be one of a talk of a series of talks. And I thought about starting off with fitness and exercise, but I kind of changed my mind and thought, well, if we're going to deal with fitness and exercise and so on, we better know how to manage fatigue, because obviously when you exercise, you're going to get fatigue, or you should get fatigue. So I thought we start off with fatigue management, and then we'll follow up later on in some more series talking about exercise. My background is I have a degree in health, physical education, recreation, I taught high school physical ed and coached football and track. And then I went into physical therapy. So exercise has been a major part of my life. And I continued even with my MS through all these years. Back in the day, 40 years ago, I started wheelchair basketball and got into road racing and some of these other things that back in the 80s was kind of unique, you might say. So needless to say, I like to talk about fatigue, and it's going to be in two parts, but it'll all be in two parts at one time. We're going to divide it into two parts. The first part, we're going to talk about what is fatigue and how it affects us, look at the types of fatigue, look at core body temperature and fatigue and how that's related, and other possible factors contributing to fatigue. And then in part two, as your handout shows, we'll get into fatigue management. So what is fatigue? Well, one of the things is the most common MS symptom. Now, I've read in some of the other literatures, they talk about other symptoms being more common, but most of the literature that I've read says that MS is the most, or fatigue is the most common one. I'd like to distinguish it from being tired. In other words, I can be tired and not feel fatigued from the MS standpoint, and I can be fatigued but not feeling tired. And the reason I like to make that distinction is because how we convey that to the people around us, our family members, neighbors, even our employers, and our people that we come in contact with. That because if you say I feel tired, then people will assume, well, maybe you should go take a nap. Well, maybe I should take a nap anyway. But I like to make that distinguish between the two. The other is that fatigue can be interactive with other MS symptoms. In other words, fatigue may exaggerate another symptom that you have. A good example that has been shown that if you exercise and get physically active and get fatigued from that, that may affect your cognition. You may have cognitive fatigue, and vice versa. Other symptoms may exaggerate your fatigue. So, and we'll get into a little more detail with that a little bit later, but other symptoms that you have from your MS may exaggerate the total amount of fatigue that you may experience. And keeping in mind, one thing is that everybody's MS is different. We have a unique situation where I may have, 5 or 6 different symptoms, and you may have 5 or 6 totally different symptoms, all under the MS. But most of us have fatigue. Fatigue tends to lead to a perception of being lazy. And it's that perception, and we're going to talk about that in another session. Perceptions mean a lot of different things. In other words, it's your perception of you. That's one type of perception, is that you may say, well, I don't want to be deemed or perceived as being lazy, so I'm going to keep working hard and hard and keep going. And then you drop. The other is that there are others that perceive you. So if you are resting to kind of catch up on your fatigue, so to speak, other people may perceive you as being lazy, okay? But the biggest thing is your perception of other people's perceptions of you. In other words, one of the things that in the beginning, what I was concerned about was how other people perceived me with the physical changes that was happening to me. And one of the things that I really didn't want was to be perceived as being lazy. So my perception of other people's perceptions of me, thinking that they may perceive me as being lazy, spurred me on to do some things that I probably shouldn't have done. one of the things that I had to overcome was perceptions, and especially other people's perceptions. Fatigue may be a disincentive for being active and doing exercise, which is kind of unique because the one thing that will help you with fatigue, and we'll talk about this in a little while, is being active and doing exercise. So it's kind of like, well, I really feel fatigued, or I don't want to get fatigued if I do exercise or I'm more active. But at the same time, being active and doing the exercise will help you with the fatigue in the long run. So it's kind of a catch-22, you might say. In a lot of cases, and this was really happening to me way in the beginning, let's say 45 years ago, is that it was unpredictable. Fatigue could come on suddenly. It was kind of rather dramatic at times, that I would feel this sense of not being able to do anything. And being in athletics all my life, I knew what fatigue was. In fact, fatigue used to be a reward. I mean, you exercise and you being active and you feel fatigue, it's a good feeling. But this kind of fatigue was not a good feeling. And it came on suddenly, which kind of went against my normal, at that time, my normal ideas of what fatigue is and what it should do. It may promote social isolation, meaning you've worked all day or you've been active all day, and then you get an invite from your neighbors that we're having a barbecue, at 5 o'clock, and you're just wiped out. So you tend not to do that. And many other situations that may promote social isolation. In essence, fatigue may be a result of over-expenditure of energy. So we have two situations. We have fatigue is a lack of energy, but to overcome the fatigue, you have to have energy. So if you overexpend your energy, then that's the cause of fatigue. It's kind of like using a credit card. If you use your credit card too much, you reach a limit, and you say, your whatever you purchased was denied because the credit card was overloaded. And so what do you do when you have an overloaded credit card is you don't use it. You can't use it. So you overextend yourself. And that's one of the results of the fatigue. Okay. And this last thing I added on later on, so it's in red. It may be a result of the aging process. In other words, we're all getting older, that's for sure. And that's something that we have to manage, but we have to manage in a right way. And a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in managing the result of the aging process. And the reason that I put that in there later on, which is not in your handout, that's why it's in red, is that my wife is very active. She swims and rides a bike and so on and so forth, exercises a lot. And a couple of weeks ago, she was saying, boy, I just can't do as much as I could that I used to do. And she was relating herself back to when she was 40 and swimming and riding a bike. And now she's in her 60s. And I said, well, that's probably because you're getting older. So after 40, everything starts declining in our bodies, unfortunately. It's kind of like planned obsolescence. We're bound to fail. We don't not long on this world, so that things start to break down. And that may be part of the cause of our fatigue. I'm really feeling that as I enter my ninth decade of ninth decade of age, coming up pretty soon, that I'm not as chipper as I used to be, let's put it that way. So there are different types of fatigue that I think are very important to understand and to get a grasp of. The first one is emotional fatigue. If you take people who don't have MS and are emotionally stressed, that stress or anxiety or depression, one of the things that they do is complain of physical fatigue. So the emotional response to having MS can be part of the fatigue that you may be feeling at other times. That's the unpredictability of it. The other is mental fatigue or cognitive fatigue, the so-called cog fog. And here's a good example of that interaction between two symptoms, so that if you are physically active, and I've experienced this many times, physically active, get physically fatigued, and then I can't make a decision, what to have for lunch, kind of a thing. So I get into that kind of a cog fog where I have difficulty maintaining any type of executive function, you might say, of making decisions about what should I do and what should I not do, and so on and so forth. So there's that interaction between symptoms that's also possibly contributing to your fatigue. As Dan said, is if there's any questions, please, raise your hand or, just jump in there as I go along. The other type of fatigue is muscle fatigue. If you take a muscle, whether you have MS or not, and you exercise it, it fatigues. And in fact, that's the reason that you're exercising it, is in order to gain strength and endurance, you have to experience the fatigue. So that muscle fatigue is really very, very important. When we talk about the interaction between symptoms in a little while, you have a better understanding of that. Then there's the so-called MS fatigue. Now, interesting, that's been around for a long time. And the medical field has a tendency to come up with sayings that explain what different things are. And this one is called, MS fatigue is actually called idiopathic lassitude. Now, if you don't know what idiopathic means, it just basically means we don't know what it is. We don't understand it. We don't know why it occurs. There's no reason for it per se. And lassitude is just that feeling of fatigue. I call it off-time fatigue, meaning that other aspects of fatigue I'm not experiencing, but in other words, I haven't exercised hard, or I ate right, and so on and so forth. But all of a sudden I had this feeling of this overwhelming sensation of fatigue, like I just can't do it. And that's the unpredictability part, is that it just happens. I don't know why it happens. I don't know when it happens. I can't predict it. It's unpredictable. But that's the so-called MS fatigue. But lastly, there's nerve fatigue. And that really, really defines what MS is. MS, as you know, is a demyelinization of the nerve, the axon, the nerve fiber. And demyelinization basically exposes the nerve, removes the insulation around the nerve, kind of like if you were to take a penknife and just scrape away the insulation of the cord going from your lamp to the output, you have a short circuiting, so to speak. If that doesn't heal right away, then the body produces scarring or sclerosis, and that's what multiple sclerosis is a scarring of the axons or the nerve fibers. When you take a demyelinated or sclerotic nerve, the impulse that goes down that nerve is at a slower rate because of the demyelinization and the sclerosis. It would be, the sclerosis is kind of like if you were to take that penknife and scrape away the insulation, and then you take a piece of electrical tape and wrap that exposed area. That would be the kind of sclerosis, the form of sclerosis. So it means that the slower there's a slower nerve conductivity. If that demyelinization occurs and the exposure of that axon or that nerve fiber is long enough, it may die. And so some nerve fatigue may be the absence of nerve conductivity. We're talking about a nerve fiber. The nerves that go in from your spinal cord or your brain, spinal cord, and your brain stem it's not one nerve. I mean, not one nerve fiber, but a multitude of nerve fibers. So you may have, let's say, 50% of those nerve fibers are demyelinated. So then you have that much more slowing of the conductivity of that impulse that's going down that nerve. So if you have enough of those, then the nerve is totally absent. It's nerve death. The other is related to increased core body temperature, or it's a so-called Uthoff's phenomenon. Has anybody ever heard of Uthoff's phenomenon?
Oh, yeah.
Somebody has? Okay.
I have.
But Uthoff was Wilhelm Uthoff was a neuro-ophthalmologist back in 1898, somewhere around there, who witnessed the fatigue in MS patients when he had a patient who had visual problems, and they became active, and their body temperature increased because of the activity, that their vision worsened. But when they cooled down, the vision got back to that normal state, whatever that normal state was. And that kind of was actually used for many years during the 20s and 30s and even 40s. And I even heard it in the 50s as a test for MS. They call it the hot bathtub test. So somebody complaining of whatever that may be a diagnosis for MS, they would put them in the hot bathtub, and if those symptoms worsened, and then they took them out of the hot bathtub and cooled them off, and the symptoms went back to normal, whatever that normal state is, then that was kind of like, oh yeah, you must have MS. Now this is all before any of the other diagnostic tools. So that was used for a long period of time to help develop the diagnosis of MS in patients. So as your core body temperature goes up, then you have slower conductivity of the nerve. Now, in a normal nerve, if you take a normal nerve and warm it up a little bit, it increases the conductivity, not a super lot, but it still improves the conductivity. But with a demyelinated sclerotic nerve, if you heat it up, then it slows the conductivity down even more. So as your core body temperature goes up, then you have an increase in nerve fatigue. I should mention that, and this came up in a discussion that I had with some other people, another situation talking about core body temperature. When we talk about the core, this is different from the core that you may be encouraged to strengthen in your exercises, core strengthening. This is not the same core, okay? This is your body's physiology tries to maintain a certain temperature to protect your heart and your brain and other vital organs like your lungs by fluctuating the temperature. So as you increase your core body temperature, you perspire. That helps to cool down the core body temperature. And if you had a really bad fever, then that is a super amount of core body temperature. And that can be very dangerous at very high levels. But the other core are the muscles surrounding the pelvis that you strengthen to get better balance and improve your gait or sitting balance or whatever it might be. So that's not the core we're talking about. We're talking about core body temperature rather than the core muscles. Okay. So there are factors that contribute to your increased core body temperature that I think you need to be aware of. First of all, there's the so-called diurnal temperature change. Now, diurnal just refers to the fluctuation of your body's temperature from morning to evening. And this happens to all of us as mammals, so to speak. The lowest body temperature is around 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and then the highest body temperature is around 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. That's going to vary from person to person, and it's going to vary, what particular activity you might be involved with. But that fluctuation can be as high as 1 degree Celsius, which is pretty good amount. So increasing core body temperature just from the diurnal temperature change may be affecting the fatigue. Obviously, the environmental temperature and humidity plays a big role. If you're in a warm room, then you're going to probably feel more fatigue. And if it's a not so warm room, but it has a high humidity, you may also feel from the fatigue from increased core body temperature. Now, I spent most of my life in Rochester, Minnesota, where obviously its environmental temperatures have ranged quite a bit. And then the past 9 years, I've been in Arizona, where the environmental temperatures are very high, even in the wintertime. That's why people go to Arizona, in the wintertime from Minnesota or Wisconsin. But high temperatures, very low humidity. The highest temperature that I was in several years ago, last year actually, was 122 degrees. That's the high of the day. Okay, the humidity was 3%. And I asked my neurologist, I've asked other people, what is the, I can understand the body temperature, core body temperature increasing because you're in a hotter environment, but how does the humidity affect that increased core body temperature? And nobody has really given me a good answer. And if somebody does know that, please tell me, because I'd like to know why or how humidity affects the core body temperature, other than perspiration or lack of perspiration. The other thing is that might contribute to increased core body temperature is being in direct sunlight. In Wisconsin, in the wintertime, if you had a little snow on your blacktop driveway and it's 0 degrees, when that sun comes out, that snow may melt because of the absorption of the sun's rays. Direct sunlight is radiant energy. So you could be in a rather cool environmental temperature being outside, but if you're sitting in the sunlight, then that could contribute to your increased core body temperature. And if you were wearing dark clothes or heavy clothes, warm clothing, that may also increase your core body temperature, because the darkness, you absorb more radiant energy from the sunlight, let's say, wearing something dark as opposed to, say, light colors that don't absorb that radiant energy. Obviously, when you're exercising or active, then that's going to increase core body temperature. But also the temperature of the food or drink that you consume is going to affect that. I always remember back in the day, and I'm dating myself, but there used to be a commercial for Campbell's tomato soup. And as a little kid would come in from the cold, take off his, winter coat and sit down at the lunch table, and his mother would give him Campbell's tomato soup to warm his little tummy. So if you drink and consume foods that are higher temperature, and this one I'm not sure about, but I just thought about this the other day when I was putting this all together, is spicy foods may cause that increased core body temperature, but I'm not a big spicy eater, so I don't know that for sure. But so whatever you're consuming, the temperature of whatever you're consuming may affect your increased core body temperature. The next one is called thermogenesis of digestion. Thermogenesis, thermo referring to heat, and genesis meaning the origin of. So the food that you eat through digestion increases core body temperature. And or may have effect on core body temperature. The type of food that you eat may differ in the thermogenesis of digestion. And I think your nutritionists that have come and talked with you may have a better understanding of which foods produce more heat energy from digestion. And of course, there's always others. Infection, if you had a, say, a wound infection, or you had a bladder infection, something like that, then that would contribute to core body temperature. And the others I put in there because I was giving this talk to a group not too long ago up in La Crosse, and somebody raised their hand, and this woman was going through menopause, and she said, when I have these hot flashes, it's hot. I feel more fatigued because my core body temperature has gone up. And she also mentioned during menstruation, the core body temperature goes up, which I have little about female physiology, so I was not aware of that until she had mentioned that. The last one that's possible is poor sweating response, and I mentioned this to Dan the other day, and I'm going to get back to that poor sweating response, but I have literally lost my ability to perspire. I cannot perspire at all, no matter how hot it is. And obviously, perspiration is a way to cool off your body. If you're in a hot environment, then you're going to perspire. And that helps to cool off at least your superficial temperature, which has an effect on your core body temperature. I can't sweat, and I think there are other people that also can't sweat, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So those are different factors that may affect your core body temperature. And the core body temperature, again, as it increases, you have more fatigue just from that alone. So, but there are other possible factors that contribute to fatigue. And one of them is, again, is the interaction of other MS symptoms. And I like to use spasticity, and I put it in red because that's not in your handout part. The spasticity is the inability for a muscle to relax when it's put on stretch. A good example of that is, let's say, your bicep muscle bends your elbow, right? And the tricep muscle on the other side straightens your elbow. Well, in order to bend your elbow actively, the tricep has to relax. And then if you straighten your elbow using your triceps, the bicep has to relax. But if you have like spasticity in your triceps and you go to bend your elbow with your bicep, then it resists. All right. The tricep is not relaxing. That's spasticity. And the faster you try to bend it, the more spasticity you have. That's why when you go to the neurologist or your healthcare provider and they take your knee and they bend it real fast, they want to see what the reaction to that spasticity may be, or they also call it a drop thing. You'll straighten your leg out and then just let it drop and see what happens. So the faster you try to move that joint, let's say bending your elbow, the more spasticity you're going to have from the muscle that opposes bending your elbow. Right? So back in the day when I was walking, which was quite a long time ago, I could walk and you wouldn't know that I had MS, other than maybe a stagger here and there. But if I try to walk fast, then my spasticity would kick in. And if I tried to run, it would really would kick in, because that was not allowing the muscle to relax slowly rather than quickly. Muscle weakness, another interaction with another MS symptoms. A good example of that is, let's say, foot drop. Some of us have foot drop. So you go to pick your knee up to take a step and your foot drops and your toe catches. So what do? You lift your knee up higher. Okay. So let's say the muscle that brings your toe up, brings your ankle up, is affected by the MS. But your hip flexor is the muscle that brings your knee up to clear that toe, has to work harder because you're raising it up higher. It's kind of like the feeling of walking in deep snow or in deep water. If you try to walk or even walk fast, then that is going to fatigue your hip flexors or the muscle that bend the knee up to overcome the foot drop. So that may cause and it may contribute to your fatigue. And I know there's ways of dealing with foot drop, but even the ways that dealing with foot drop, like say a splint, that makes your whole leg heavier. And that means that your hip flexor again is going to have to work a little bit harder to raise that knee up so that the whole foot can clear again. And then you have perineal nerve stimulators. They're not very heavy, but that can help you with the foot drop, but that's another discussion. And then there's good old bowel and bladder dysfunction. If you go to the bathroom many, many times a day for whatever reason.
Or night.
Huh?
Or night.
Yeah.
Or night, well, I'm going to talk about that later. But yes, or night, that's going to affect your fatigue. That's going to may contribute to your fatigue. And that, since we just talked about that, sleep deprivation. You don't get a good night's sleep, you're going to be fatigued. Anybody, whether you have MS or not, is going to have an effect on your fatigue. And one of the problems that a lot of us with MS have are leg spasms, especially at night, or so-called restless leg syndrome, which is kind of the feeling like you got to move them. You got to move them. And I felt that at night. That would prevent me from getting a good night's sleep. And the other is periodic limb movement, where you are asleep and usually the leg will move, will jump. That prevents you from getting a good night's sleep. If you don't get into REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is the deep sleep, deep dream sleep, you don't get a good night's sleep, even if you are so-called asleep. Which comes to the other one is sleep apnea. And the sleep apnea is where you stop breathing. Apnea means no breathing. Apnea is no breathing during your sleep, and that's caused by an obstruction in your upper airway, in the back of your throat. Your soft palate collapses. And there are two kinds. There's primary, which is neurologically affects that mechanism that allows your airway to remain open. And then there's called secondary, or where the weight of your neck, if you have overweight, then that's going to affect possibly causing that airway to collapse. That can be very dangerous, sleep apnea, but it does interfere with your sleep. So even if you're asleep, you're not really in that deep sleep. Another example of sleep apnea is snoring, excessive snoring. It's usually a pretty good indication of possibly sleep apnea. Going back to bowel and bladder again, it's like if you're going many times during the night, you don't get good sleep. So all of those factors may interfere with your sleep, and sleep is very, very important. And then pain, and we haven't talked about pain at all, or won't talk about it because that's a whole other subject to talk about. But some of those leg spasms are painful, joint pain, overdoing pain, whatever it may be, the pain of just getting older may interfere with your sleep. It's kind of interesting, going back to that. A long time ago, when I first started with MS, pain was not considered a symptom of MS. And if you had pain, they wouldn't think of MS. But nowadays, the more, the modern approach to MS is that pain can be a direct result, can be a symptom of MS. The mechanism of which I am not familiar, but But as a physical therapist, I dealt with pain well, my whole career, not my pain, but other people's pain. But the pain that's associated as a direct symptom of MS, I could not explain. Now, coming to the possible autonomic nervous system dysfunction. The autonomic nervous system is separate from the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is what MS is affecting. Your brain, your spinal cord, and your brain stem, as opposed to the nerve in your arm is not affected by the MS, okay? The demyelinization is occurring centrally, not peripherally. Well, there's also an autonomic nervous system that has, autonomic nervous system is basically autonomic, meaning automatic. You don't think about doing it. Sweating, hair growth, nail growth, digestion, peristalsis, the movement of material through your gut. Those are all autonomic nervous system, but one big one is poor sweat response. In other words, my inability to perspire is a result of the autonomic nervous system dysfunction as a result of having MS. And I've been tested with this. A long time ago, I complained about it. In fact, I was playing wheelchair basketball, and we had a timeout during the game, and a lot of the players who didn't have MS, asked the coach for a towel to wipe off their brow because they were all sweaty, and I realized I wasn't sweating at all. I didn't have, and in my athletic career, I sweated a lot. Okay, so it was kind of a rude awakening. It's like, why am I not sweating? I complained to my doctor, my neurologist, and he put me through a thermoregulatory test where they cover your body with a powder that changes color when it gets moist. And then they put me in a baker for like 15 minutes at 120 degrees, something like that. And that would make you sweat. Well, then they take a picture of it, and then they compare the different colors to determine whether or not you're sweating. And I had like 12% sweat in my body. And that was 40 years ago, well, maybe 35 years ago. Lose track after a while. Now I have zero perspiration. Even at 120 degrees in Arizona sun, I do not sweat. Or Wisconsin sun at 100 degrees, whatever. But the other part of that autonomic nervous system dysfunction.
So that's, for you, that's a symptom of MS?
Sorry?
So that's from MS?
It's an indirect, the actual mechanism of how it affects the autonomic nervous system, I do not know. I've explored it, but I can't find a good reason why MS, demyelinization of the central nervous system, affects the autonomic nervous system. I don't know. Though the vagus nerve is, I have to think about that. Exactly. Thank you for asking that question. I wouldn't say it's a symptom, but it's a result of.
Yeah, that's on
Okay, that's a better way of saying it. The other is the autonomic nervous system controls your heart rate and blood pressure. So if you become active, whether you're exercising or just getting up and moving around or whatever you do, your heart rate goes up to supply blood to your muscles and to get rid of the byproducts of muscle physiology, okay? But if you don't have good blood supply, then you're gonna get fatigued because the blood supply or the heart can't keep up with the demands that the body, the muscles, let's say, are asking of it. Well, I fall into that category too, is that when I exercise, my heart rate doesn't go up. And when we talk about fitness in the future, you have to get to really get into endurance exercises, for instance. you have to go into aerobic exercise. Now, what's aerobic means? It means that your heart rate goes up high enough that it's going to have a positive effect on your body. So when you exercise and you are at aerobic capacity, let's say, there's a formula that says 80% of 220 minus your age determines the target heart rate. So if you exercise and you're trying to get up to that point to be aerobic, well, in my case, because my autonomic nervous system dysfunction does not allow my heart rate to go up, I can't get there. So I can't really get, I mean, I have some effect in endurance exercise by getting my heart rate up, but not aerobic. So it just has another possible fatigue issue because, again, if the heart can't supply the blood for the nutrients, the oxygen particularly, and get rid of CO2 and some of the other byproducts of metabolism, then you're going to get fatigue because your heart just can't supply the blood. And the reason it's not supplying the blood because it's not responding to the amount of activity that requires that increase in blood. I know, okay. I have primary progressive. I have never been on any of the disease modifying therapies, but I understand that just taking some of those causes fatigue. I'll just throw that in there because I really can't comment on it. And I can't comment because I don't have that experience. Pain can contribute, like I said before. If people who complain of fatigue, that have pain, complain of fatigue, whether you have MS or not, pain can be hard on a lot of different parts of your body, especially your mind. But that's one of the things is fatigue. Poor nutrition. If you don't eat right, you don't eat, and that's not my expertise. I know you have a nutritionist come in and talk to you about nutrition, appropriate nutrition. But if you don't get the proper nutrition, then you don't have the byproduct, not the byproducts, but the foundation of vitamins and minerals to affect your muscle activity, particularly, then you're going to get fatigue. And inadequate levels of hydration. If you have bladder problems, there's a tendency not to drink. Well, if you don't get enough to drink, then you can experience fatigue because of lack of hydration. So how do you find that balance between getting enough fluids, whatever they might be, and yet not doing so much that you are going to the bathroom all the time? That's a whole other topic of discussion at a future date, maybe. Okay. Inactivity is probably to me, is one of the biggest factors of contributing to fatigue. And I have what I call the cycle of diminished activity, and which is a definite factor contributing to fatigue. So you get fatigue, and a lot of people think that, well, if I'm going to get fatigued, then in order to do that, I have to conserve my energy, which is a term I don't like. So in order to do that, I diminish my activity. I sit in my lazy boy and watch Oprah or whatever. Okay. But by doing that, too much of that, you get deconditioned because you're not active. And the deconditioning leads to more fatigue. So it becomes cyclic. And you can start at any point. You could have diminished activity for a different reason. You become diminished or deconditioned. That causes fatigue. So that cycle is, I think, the major contributing factor in fatigue in toto when it comes to MS. So how do you break that cycle? Fatigue management, and that leads into part 2. And that is looking at, first of all, and we'll talk about fatigue management, what are the keys to successful fatigue management? And then we're going to look at the strategies for fatigue management. And then finally, what are the takeaway messages that from this whole presentation? I really believe that we, people with MS, need to become an expert in our fatigue, or excuse me, our MS. Whatever your symptoms, everybody's symptoms are different. Everybody's MS is different. You need to know what, in order to manage your fatigue and get into self-management of your MS, not self-treatment, self-managing. And the treatment comes from your physicians and your therapists or whatever. But the management, you have to become an expert in your own disease. Not in somebody else's, not in your neighbor's disease, but in your disease, in your MS. The other key to successful fatigue management is having realistic, flexible expectations, but avoiding procrastination, and I'll get into that a little bit. And rejecting negative perceptions, like I said before, about your perception of other people's perception of you may resist or interfere with your fatigue management. And then again, maintaining healthy levels of exercise, activity, nutrition, and hydration, which is wellness in itself, which is a whole other subject too. So I'm going to present 4 different strategies for managing your fatigue. The first is to strive for a healthy living lifestyle, as I say, adequate exercise, nutrition, and hydration. And there is another aspect of that that I would like to get into at a different point, would be getting into the emotional and cognitive and spiritual aspects of healthy living, but I'm not going to do that now. So there's basically different components of healthy living lifestyle, is to try to strive for exercising 2 to 3 times a week. The amount of exercise and the type of exercise that you do may vary during those 2 or 3 times a week. And you're getting, when you go to Dan's facility there, then Wednesday and Friday, then you are fulfilling that kind of that requirement for striving for healthy lifestyle. The other is to engage in mild to moderate activities as tolerated. Now that goes beyond exercise. That might be going for a walk or going, riding a bike or stationary bike at home. Not as an exercise, just to keep your body moving, to get away from that diminished activity kind of cycle. Eating a well-balanced diet, and then maintaining adequate levels of fluids. That's all in the striving for and becoming an expert in your disease and how that may affect your fatigue. The second strategy is to monetize your energy levels, meaning put a price on it. Give your perceived, and I'm going to underline perceived energy amount a dollar value. In other words, you wake up and you say, I think I have $100 of fatigue that I can spend. Okay, $100 of energy that I can spend. One day you might have $100, and another day you have $75, or another day you have $50 or $5 or whatever it may be. But if you monetize and say, well, how am I going to, it gets into the next strategy. How am I going to spend that? You only have $100. You have $100 of energy. How are you going to expend it? Now, the important thing about that is you get that energy the next day, but you can't save energy from the day before. Okay, so somebody say, well, I have $100 of energy today. If I only use 50, then I'll add that 50 tomorrow. And no, it doesn't work that way. You lose it if you don't use it. So if you perceive, whatever your perception of energy is that particular day, if you monetize it and then you kind of look at how am I going to spend that money, okay? And that gets into the third one is prioritizing your energy expenditure. And I use the old, I don't know if you're familiar with the old food pyramid, which was pretty dominant of maybe 20 years ago, where the foods that you eat, the most of the food is on the bottom and the least amount is on the top. So fruits and vegetables on the top and oils and fats on the top. Fruits and vegetables on the bottom, you're going to eat most of that, and then a little amount of food, fat and sweets and so on and so forth. So take that pyramid and say, okay, how am I going to use that $100, let's say, of energy that I'm going to spend, and where would I spend that the most? Would be on the bottom, and then the next would be above that, and so on and so forth. So just as an example, and I'm not in that situation now. Whoops. Back in the day, not too long ago, when I was working, I'd expend most of that energy to work, whatever that work was. And in order to do that work, I had to do my activities of daily living, my ADLs, taking care of myself and, being clean, you might say, and, having something to wear and so on and so forth. I'd expend some of that money, that energy on doing that. And then if I had any left over, exercise, and then leisure activities and volunteering. Now, any day that can vary, and that's going to vary for whatever you want to do with your $100 or $75, whatever it may be. So if you can prioritize and say, well, today, like today, for me, this is a big expenditure of my energy is doing this presentation. You say, well, it's just getting prepared for it. So I know that there might have been some other things that I want to do, but I may not have the energy to do it. So I focused in on doing this presentation and getting ready for it. And that's where I'm spending most of my dollar amount of energy, let's put it that way. And then lastly, and this is really important on various levels, is to balance activity with rest while performing a task. Okay? In other words, what you do is you take that task, whatever it is, and since you're you keep moving MS, say you're exercising, you chunk your activities. You say, well, I'm going to expend so much energy on and be active for that period of time, but then take a rest, a short rest, depending on what you're doing, and then being active. So the idea of being active and then resting, active and resting during that task, whatever that task is. An extreme one, back in the day when I had a house with a lawn and I had to mow the lawn, what I did was to say, okay, I would mow, let's say, a third of the lawn and sit down and take a rest. And that's where that perception is as well. Before I learned how to do that, it's like, oh, I'm just going to keep going because I don't want my neighbor to think I'm lazy sitting here, in the shade and, resting. But I found out that if I took that rest and then did another third of mowing the lawn and then rested, the last third was not too bad. But if I didn't take the rest, toward the end and try to do it all in one fell swoop, at the end, I was not doing a very good job, and my fatigue was kicking in, and I just wasn't able to do a very good job at the very end. But if I chunked it and broke that task down into parts and then rested in between each of those parts. Now take that as a macro of that concept and put it into the micro. Okay, so let's say you're exercising and you're doing an exercise, let's say bicep curls. Now, a lot of times people would say, well, I'm going to do 10, just pump them out, kind of thing. But I found that with not only myself, but the patients that I worked with, was that toward the end, the quality of those exercises, that particular task, was diminishing. But if you took a little bit of a rest in between each repetition, the quality remained pretty good. So in other words, the task, meaning bicep curls with a weight, okay, you do, as you start to fatigue, then you stop in between each repetition. And I call it 1 breath rest, or even a 2 breath rest, so that you're active and then you rest, and you're active and then you rest during that task, whatever that task happens to be. For instance, when I get dressed in the morning, it takes me a while for my situation. So what I'll do while doing that is that I'll just stop and just take a pause. So I'm active, trying to get my pants on or whatever. And then I just rest, just a couple of breaths, and that calms me down, and then continue with the test. If I continue to keep trying without taking that rest, my quality of what I'm doing diminishes and I get fatigued. So that's a concept that really, I discovered with my patients before I applied it to myself. And if we talk in the future about exercise, I can go into that further. So, key takeaways from this, what we're talking about. Fatigue is normal and heat related. Body temperature goes up, you're going to be more fatigued. Fatigue is a complex of variables. There's a lot of things that can contribute to fatigue. To me, it's inevitable, yet manageable. The other takeaway is become an expert in your MS. And lastly, healthy lifestyle practices with appropriate levels of exercise, nutrition, hydration are the components of maintaining a steady levels of energy. You're going to wear out, you're going to use the energy, but you use it in an equitable way, and you manage it better. That's the key message that I'm trying to present. Every day is different, but be flexible. Prioritize your activities, avoid procrastination, and again, balance activity and rest, or like I say, chunk it. So, questions, comments, concerns? If you don't have any right now, that's my email address. It's on the handout. And for those who MSSUX, if you're the phonetically challenged, that says MS sucks at mac.com. Easy way to remember. Question.
What do you think the energy percentage, maybe it's not even, doesn't really matter, but doesn't it play into effect just the fact that, walking across a room takes people with MS more mental energy than it does.
Mental energy, you say?
Yeah, I mean,
I can't hear you real well.
For me, expending mental energy really leads to my fatigue.
Oh yeah, that's where that comes in, because you're concentrating so much on walking and making sure that your toe doesn't catch, or your balance is, you're going to fall down. That mental energy, you're right. That's one of the contributors. That's what I'm saying, is that all of those different types of MS or types of fatigue add to the total package of fatigue. So yes, that's very important. Back in the day when I was walking, here's talk about, I would have to think about taking every step, because if I try to do something else, multitask, you might say, with my hands or even my brain, then my toe would catch or I'd stumble. So that's a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up, is that all of those all those types of fatigue add to the total package of fatigue. It's not that you separate one from the other, but they all can combine into one, and that's the effect of fatigue. Good question. Hope that answered your question.
Good question, Tom. I'm taking copious notes on everything you said. And for the past week, I've had my 10-year-old granddaughter home with me. None of this.
Sorry, I really can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Al says last week he's had his 10-year-old granddaughter home with him.
Oh,
And
And I'm trying to apply all these notes to that. And she goes home tomorrow, so next week I will.
I think she's wearing him out.
I didn't hear all of that. I'm sorry.
Grandchild.
I can imagine. Yeah. You're having trouble moving and you watch this 10-year-old or anybody just be active. It's like, whoa, talk about jealousy and envy. Talk about mental fatigue. It's like you try to keep up with them mentally, you can't even keep up with them.
So Tom, I think one of the things that was really interesting to me is how everything you said basically relates to all of us with MS. And I'm not sure that other people around us realize that that's kind of what we're going through.
Nope.
I think you put it pretty well, that, explained it pretty well on what we're all going through, that, this recording may even be really good for some of our carekeepers or some of our loved ones or somebody else
Yeah.
that's helping us, trying to understand what we're actually going through, because I think you nailed a lot of it as far as the fatigue goes.
I think that brings up a good point, because part of my series of talk about that, and trying to relate to people who don't have MS can be very difficult. And get into telling our story, and our story is a perception of what happened to us. And there are different processes through which we go that convey to other people how we feel and what's happening to our bodies. That's very important, but at the same time, it can can turn off other people. So you have to be careful about that. But I'd love to get into that discussion sometime very soon, because that's been one of my biggest things. And I try to bring that out in both of those books. And it's funny and I self-published those books. And I did pretty well with the first one, but at least I broke even. The second one, but as soon as you write a book like that, trying to convey to other people whether they have MS or not, as soon as I reread it after it was published, it's like, why did I say that? Or I should have said that. I feel like rewriting both of them together again. But anyway, yeah, that whole process of trying to convey to others how we feel, and whatever symptom that might be, that's very difficult. That's very difficult. Very difficult for especially your spouse or your family members, that people are close by, or your employer. Very hard.
Yeah.
Very, very hard.
Yeah, the employer, that's huge.
Well, if you do come up with any questions or concerns or comments, please give me a shout out through my email. Just put something in there and subject matter of or subject line, that it's coming from you. Otherwise, you get so much spam. You don't know what you're doing. And I checked my junk mail too. So
One thing that Tom did offer to all of us on an individual basis is, if you do have any questions about you specifically and about what you're going through, he's here for you to be able to reach out.
Yep.
And he's very responsive as far as with me and stuff too. So
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And we'll look forward to another session on some other. I'd like to really talk about exercise. That's my whole life, is the exercise. So
here we are holding you back with fatigue. You really want to get the exercise.
right? I'm sorry, I didn't catch all that.
I said, here we are holding you back with fatigue, and you want to get the exercise. We'll get there.
We get there.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. I don't know how to get out of that.
So, he's very good.